The first time my father said girls don't need college, I was 11 years old, standing barefoot in our kitchen with a science fair ribbon in my hand and dirt still under my nails from the volcano project I had built in the garage. The last time he said anything like that, I was already a physician, already wearing my own white coat, already signing my own patients' charts. And he was standing in a banquet hall telling strangers he had always known I'd do something special. Nobody at that table knew he had spent half my life trying to make sure I never got the chance. Let me take you back. If this story resonates with you, like and subscribe, but only if it feels true to something you have lived. I grew up in a narrow 2-story house in Lexington, Kentucky, with squeaky stairs, a chain-link fence, and a father who believed sons were investments and daughters were temporary guests. His name was Warren. He sold industrial parts to factories across 3 counties and carried himself like a man who thought volume and certainty were the same thing as wisdom. My mother, Elaine, worked part-time at a church daycare until my youngest brother started elementary school. And after that, she mostly stayed home, stretching casseroles, folding laundry, and trying to smooth whatever tension my father had dragged in from work. I was the oldest of 3. Then came my brother Luke. Then my brother Ben. If you had only looked at our family in photographs, you might have thought we were ordinary. A little stiff, a little dated, but ordinary. The truth lived in smaller things. In who got new cleats and who got hand-me-down shoes. In whose report cards were framed and whose were acknowledged with a distracted nod. In which mistakes were called boys being boys, and which were treated like warnings about a girl's future. I learned that difference early. At 9, I brought home a spelling bee certificate and my father said, "That's nice, honey," without looking up from the baseball game. At 9, Luke hit a double in Little League and my father took him for ice cream, called his uncles, and retold the story 3 times before bedtime. At 10, I spent 2 weeks building a model of the solar system with painted foam balls and fishing wire. My father walked past it in the dining room and said, "You put all that time into this?" I thought he meant it as admiration. I said, "Yeah." He shook his head and laughed. "You've got a hard-working streak. Good. You'll need it when you have a family." I did not have language for what I felt then. Not exactly hurt. Not exactly anger. Something quieter. The sensation of being moved, gently but firmly, toward a smaller room than the one I had imagined for myself. School was the place where I felt largest. I loved everything about it. The smell of dry erase markers, the cold hum of fluorescent lights before first bell, fresh notebooks, textbooks with diagrams I wanted to memorize for no reason, except that understanding things made me feel less helpless in a house where too much depended on mood. Science became my first private religion. Cells, bones, blood flow, respiration, the geometry of the body. By middle school, I was checking out anatomy books from the public library that were technically meant for older students. I would sit cross-legged on my bed under the window unit's rattle and copy terms into a notebook just because I liked how precise they were. Clavicle, aorta, femur, ventricle. The body made sense to me in ways family never did. If a system broke, there was a reason. If damage happened, it left evidence. If something hurt long enough, it could be named. That mattered. At 11, I won first place in the district science fair with a project on bacterial growth in household environments. It sounds bigger than it was. Poster board, petri dishes, cotton swabs, a week of careful notes. But to me, it felt enormous. I came home with the ribbon pinned to my jacket and the kind of happiness that makes your chest feel too full for your ribs. My father was at the kitchen table with one boot off, one still on, eating leftover chili out of a bowl. I put the ribbon in front of him and said, "I won." He looked at it. Actually looked. Blue ribbon, district seal, my name in neat block letters. Then he nodded and said, "That's nice." I waited for the rest. The smile, the question, the pride. Instead, he took another bite and added, "Just don't get too carried away." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He leaned back in the chair and wiped his mouth. "I mean, it's good to do well in school. But girls don't need to chase every dream that comes along. You'll get married. Have kids. Life will sort itself out." My mother was at the stove then. I remember because I looked at her, expecting her to correct him. She did not. She stirred the pot and said, very softly, "Your father just means life looks different for girls." That was how it always happened. He drew the line. She softened the edges. The line stayed. I took the ribbon upstairs and pinned it to the inside of my closet door. Not because I was proud. Because I did not want him deciding where it belonged. By the time I was 13, Luke had a private hitting coach and Ben was in an advanced travel soccer program 2 towns over. The house calendar filled with their schedules. Practice. Games. Tournaments. Fundraisers. Uniform fittings. My mother spent Saturdays in folding chairs on sidelines. My father spent money like their futures were obvious, and therefore worth financing. When I asked to attend a summer academic camp at the university, a 3-day STEM program for girls, my father laughed like I had requested a trip to the moon. "It's $400, he said. "For what? So you can build robots and come home with a t-shirt?" "It's a scholarship program too," I said. "My teacher thinks I have a good shot if I apply." He shrugged. "Then apply. But we're not paying for extras like that." 2 weeks later, he bought Luke a new aluminum bat that cost more than the camp fee. That is how favoritism works when it wants plausible deniability. It never announces itself. It just keeps choosing. I got the scholarship. Full fee covered. Even lunch. When the letter came, my science teacher hugged me so hard, my glasses went crooked. My father said, "Well, good for you." Then he asked whether I could be home in time to watch Ben, while my parents drove Luke to a showcase game that same weekend. I said the camp ended Sunday afternoon. He frowned as if I had scheduled it personally to inconvenience baseball. By high school, everyone in the family had a role. Luke was the athlete with charisma. Ben was the sweet one. I was the difficult daughter with too many opinions and grades that nobody knew what to do with. Teachers adored me. Relatives praised me in ways that almost always made my father uncomfortable. "She's going to be something," my aunt would say at Thanksgiving. Or, "That girl has a brain on her." My father would smile tightly and answer, "Brains are fine. Character matters more." It took me years to hear what was under that sentence. He did not say it when people praised my brothers. Only me. As if ambition in a girl required moral correction. I was 15 when I first said the word doctor out loud at home. Not vaguely. Not something in medicine. Doctor. I remember the exact moment because it split my life into before and after. We were eating pot roast at the kitchen table. The window over the sink was fogged from boiling potatoes. Luke was talking about baseball recruiting, even though he was only a sophomore, and Ben was complaining that his history teacher gave too much homework. My mother asked what classes I planned to take junior year. I said AP Biology if I got in. My father grunted. Good class. Then I said, I think I want to be a doctor. The room went still for half a second. Then Luke laughed first. Not mean exactly. Just startled. Like I had said, I wanted to become an astronaut on horseback. My mother smiled in that cautious way she did, when she hoped everyone might stay calm if she performed normalcy quickly enough. That's ambitious. My father set down his fork. Doctor? Yes. He leaned back. You mean nurse? The sentence landed harder than shouting would have. I said, no, doctor. His face changed. Not rage. Dismissal. The look men wear when they believe the world itself is already on their side. Caroline, he said. Girls don't need college the way boys do. My ears rang. I remember that clearly. My own pulse suddenly louder than the room. What? He spoke as if he were explaining weather to a child. I'm not saying don't take classes. I'm saying be sensible. Women end up with debt and degrees they don't use. Then they have babies, and the whole thing becomes a waste. My mother said, Warren. A warning. Too late. He went on. If Luke wants college, that's building a future. Ben, too. Men have to provide. For girls. College is optional, unless there's some special reason. I said nothing. Because sometimes humiliation enters the room so fully that language leaves. Luke was staring at his plate. Ben looked confused more than anything. My mother reached for the gravy boat and said, Let's not turn dinner into an argument. But it was already an argument. Not allowed. Inside me. I slept maybe 3 hours that night. I sat at my desk under a lamp with a loose bulb and made myself a promise I was too young to understand the cost of. If no one in this house was going to build a path for me, I would build one myself. And I did. Not cleanly. Not nobly. With resentment. With stubbornness. With caffeine and borrowed textbooks and a level of self-discipline that was probably not entirely healthy, I studied in every spare minute. At lunch, on buses, in the car during my brother's practices, at the kitchen table after everyone else went to bed. I took AP classes, worked weekends at a grocery store starting at 16, saved every check except what I needed for gas and school fees. When relatives slipped me birthday money, I put it in a shoebox, marked college in black marker, and hid it behind winter blankets in my closet. My father thought my job was good experience. He liked work if it looked practical enough to keep my ambition from becoming visible. What he did not know was that I was using every dollar to buy myself options. At school, I found adults who took me seriously. Mrs. Patel, my biology teacher, who let me stay after class to use old lab materials for practice. Mr. Henley, the guidance counselor, who taught me how merit scholarships actually worked and said, Your numbers are strong enough to make money answer to you if you're strategic. Dr. Sarah Klein, a pediatrician who spoke at Career Day and later let me shadow at her clinic twice a month. The first time I saw her examine a toddler with a fever, reassure a frightened mother, review labs, and then move seamlessly into the next room to catch a heart murmur another doctor might have missed. Something inside me clicked into place with the certainty of a lock turning. This, not the idea of being respected, not the white coat itself. This work, this usefulness, this way of bringing calm into fear. When I told Dr. Klein my father did not think medical school made sense for girls, she looked at me over the rim of her coffee mug and said, "Then make sure he's not financing your confidence." That line stayed with me for years. At 17, I got my first acceptance letter. University of Kentucky. Then 2 more. Then a partial merit package from Vanderbilt that made my guidance counselor actually clap in his office. I brought the letters home in a manila folder because I had decided, against my better judgment, that documented proof might finally force pride out of my father. It did not. He sat in his recliner, glasses low on his nose, and read the scholarship offers like service estimates from a mechanic. "How much debt?" he asked. I said I could combine grants, work study, merit money, and federal loans. He shook his head. "That's not an answer." "It is an answer. It's a bad one." My mother sat on the couch, twisting a dish towel in her hands. Luke was out with friends. Ben was upstairs gaming. The room smelled like lemon polish and whatever casserole my mother had baked earlier. I stood there holding my folder like a shield. My father tapped the paper. "I am not taking loans for a daughter to go play career woman in some city. It's not happening. I'm not asking you to take loans." He looked up sharply. "Then what are you asking?" I swallowed. Maybe for the first time in my life, I answered him without softness. "Nothing." He frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I'm going anyway." My mother whispered, "Caroline." But I kept my eyes on him. "I'm going anyway." The silence after that was so total, I could hear the refrigerator motor kick on in the kitchen. My father stood. He was not a giant of a man, but anger always made him seem larger because everything around it had to shrink. "If you walk out of this house with debt for some fantasy, I don't expect me to rescue you." I said, "I don't." And that was the truth. The sad part is that it stopped being sad years before I admitted it. He refused to fill out financial forms for months, refused to sign what he needed to sign, refused to provide tax documents on time. Every obstacle he could place without openly announcing sabotage. He placed, if not for Mr. Henley, who called my mother directly and walked her through which records I could legally submit and which deadlines I could still salvage. I might have lost the first round of aid entirely. My mother helped quietly, never in front of him, never enough to challenge the system, but enough that I knew some part of her understood what was being done to me. She would slip forms under my bedroom door after midnight, leave envelopes on the washing machine with sticky notes that said mailed. Once, when I was spiraling over tuition numbers at the kitchen table, she placed a mug of tea by my elbow and said, "If I had been braver younger, I might have wanted this too." That is one of the saddest sentences anyone has ever said to me, because it explained her and failed me at the same time. Before I tell you what happened next, Drop strength if you stayed strong when no one at home believed in you. Because sometimes the first people you have to outrun are the ones sharing your last name. I left for college in late August with 2 duffel bags, 3 storage bins, secondhand scrubs for my volunteer hours, and $812 in a checking account I guarded like a state secret. My father did not help load the car. Luke was at batting practice. Ben was at a friend's house. My mother stood in the driveway, dabbing at her eyes with the hem of her cardigan, and saying practical things because emotional things would have broken her open too far. Call when you get there. Keep your gas receipts. Don't skip meals to save money. My father came out only once, when the trunk was already closed. He leaned against the garage and said, "You can still change your mind." I looked at him, at the faded siding, at the driveway cracks with weeds in them, at the man who had spent years confusing his fear of irrelevance with authority. "No," I said. He crossed his arms. "When this gets too hard, don't say I didn't warn you." I got in the car and drove away without answering. My hands were shaking so badly on the steering wheel that I had to pull into a gas station 10 miles later just to breathe. College was nothing like the glossy brochures. It smelled like bleach, ramen, old carpet, and stress. My dorm room was narrow as a shoebox, and somehow always either too cold or too hot. My roommate changed majors 3 times freshman year and cried whenever she got a B. I worked in the dining hall before sunrise 3 days a week, wiped tables in the student center on weekends, and took notes for a disability services office because it paid a little better than shelving books. I learned how to make coffee stretch, how to study with headaches, how to smile politely when wealthier students complained about not liking the color of their spring break condo. I also learned that I was good enough. That mattered most. Because when someone tells you long enough that your ambition is indulgence, succeeding in a hard place feels almost like recovering from hypnosis. Organic chemistry nearly broke me. So did physics. So did one November when my meal plan was nearly out. My campus job hours were cut, and I ate peanut butter on crackers for 4 straight dinners because I was too proud to ask for help until my lab partner finally looked at me and said, "You're shaking." I went to a campus pantry after that and cried in the cereal aisle because they had free bananas, and suddenly I could not hold all of myself together anymore. Still, I stayed. Semester by semester, loan by loan, exam by exam. I volunteered at the student clinic, shadowed whenever I could, studied while everyone else slept. And every time I thought about quitting, I heard my father's voice saying girls don't need college the way boys do. Nothing has ever fueled me like spite disciplined into structure. Luke, meanwhile, got into a regional university on partial athletic hopes and family funding. My father co-signed his apartment, bought him a better car sophomore year after the old one wasn't reliable enough, paid for summer showcase camps even after Luke's performance plateaued. Ben eventually chose business school and received the same treatment. Not unlimited money. We were not rich, but money arranged around male possibility. That is a different thing. When I came home for holidays, the comparison was subtle until it was not. Luke's classes were an investment. Ben's internships were networking. My exhaustion was self-inflicted. At Thanksgiving my sophomore year, my father asked in front of cousins whether I was still doing the doctor thing. I said yes. He cut turkey, didn't look up, and said, "Well, At least if it doesn't pan out. You can always teach. Teach. As if every ambitious woman's failure should still loop back into service. The table laughed lightly. Not cruelly. That was worse. Cruelty is easier to resist than tradition. I smiled so hard my jaw hurt. Then I went upstairs later and cried in my childhood bathroom with the fan on, so no one would hear me. Medical school applications were a war all by themselves. Face. Travel. Interview clothes. Secondary essays that wanted you to package your pain into resilience without sounding bitter. I took a gap year because I had to. Worked as a medical scribe in an emergency department. Overnight shifts. Fluorescent fatigue. The smell of antiseptic and coffee and panic. 12-hour stretches where lives changed under bright lights, and no one cared whether you had slept enough to pronounce the medication list correctly. I loved it. Not every second. But the work, the pace, the discipline, the intimacy of seeing real fear and knowing your presence could lower it by even a degree. I shared a tiny apartment with 2 other women and paid my loans when I could and application fees when I had to. The first time I got a medical school interview invitation, I was in the hospital parking lot, eating yogurt with a plastic spoon. I looked at my phone, read the email twice, then put my forehead against the steering wheel and laughed until I cried. I called my mother first. She gasped so loudly I had to pull the phone away from my ear. Then she whispered, "Don't tell your father until you have to. That should tell you everything." I got into one school, then another, then the one I actually wanted most. University of Louisville School of Medicine. I printed the acceptance email at the hospital and folded it into my backpack like something holy. When I told my father, he stared at me a long time. Not proud. Not happy. Something more complicated and uglier. Threatened. Maybe. Then he said, "That's a long road for a woman if she wants a family." I said, "Good thing it's my road." That was the first time I watched my brothers look at me with something besides sibling habit. Luke looked uncomfortable. Ben looked impressed. My father looked furious that confidence had arrived in me without his permission. Medical school was harder than everything before it put together. That is not drama. That is math. The volume, the pressure, the debt, the sleep deprivation, the bone-deep terror of being responsible for facts that matter. I had classmates whose parents were physicians, lawyers, people with enough money to smooth emergencies before they became crises. They had apartments with quiet study rooms. I had a studio with a radiator that clanged every night and a neighbor who played bass after midnight. They had parents who mailed Costco snacks and Venmo'd rent gaps. I had work-study research hours, tutoring, and an internal terror of financial collapse that made me track every dollar in color-coded spreadsheets. When my father spoke about me then, which was rare, he did it in one of 2 ways. To my face, skepticism. To outsiders, cautious distance. Never support. Never pride. He would ask if I was still in school, as if the institution remained a vague hobby. Or sigh. Medicine is very demanding, in the tone of someone discussing a poorly chosen mountain. And yet every holiday, every graduation party, every funeral where relatives asked how I was doing, I noticed him watching reactions when people heard the word med school. Watching. Measuring. The first hints of future ownership always arrive before the theft itself. I was in my third year, deep in rotations, when my mother ended up in the hospital for a gallbladder surgery. Routine. Mostly. But enough to bring the family together in one waiting room full of stale coffee, blue vinyl chairs, and forced concern. I came straight from an overnight shift in navy scrubs with my hair still pinned badly and compression socks under my sneakers. Luke arrived 20 minutes later in a golf pullover. Ben came from work in a button-down that still had fold lines at the cuffs. My father looked tired and more fragile than I was used to seeing, which should have softened me more than it did. Fear often reveals who people are. He introduced me to the surgeon as our daughter, Caroline. She's in school for some medical thing. Some medical thing. The surgeon smiled politely and asked what year. Third. I said. Oh? He said, then you're in the thick of it. My father laughed as if this was light conversation and said, she always was the stubborn one. That sentence sat in my chest all day. Because he could have said disciplined, brilliant, committed. He chose stubborn. He always chose language that made my achievements sound like defects that happened to be useful. Still, I stayed for the surgery, reviewed my mother's discharge instructions, explained the medications to her twice because the post-anesthesia fog was making her repeat questions, drove her home, made soup, left extra notes by the pillbox. As I was rinsing dishes in their kitchen that evening, my mother sat at the table and watched me quietly. Then she said, he doesn't know how to be proud without feeling small. I kept rinsing. That sounds like his problem? She gave a sad smile. It is. But that had been my whole childhood too. His problem treated as household climate. I graduated medical school at 30. No one in our family had ever done anything like it. Not cousins, not uncles, not grandparents. No one. The ceremony was in May. Bright heat already settling into the city. Black robes, red hoods, rows and rows of folding chairs. I remember the smell of sunscreen, grass, and hot fabric. I remember my hands shaking under the sleeves of my gown. I remember hearing my name and feeling, for one impossible second, both entirely alone and accompanied by every version of myself that had ever stayed up late under bad light, trying to become this woman. My mother cried through the whole ceremony. Ben stood and clapped when my name was called. Luke whooped loud enough to embarrass himself. My father applauded too. Measured. Contained. But present. Afterward. While people moved across the lawn taking pictures in clusters of joy and exhaustion, he stood beside me for a photo and said, just low enough that only I could hear, you did it? Not congratulations. Not I'm proud of you. You did it. Like he was still a spectator to weather. I said, yes. Then our aunt asked for a family photo, and he stepped closer. One hand on my shoulder, smiling broadly for the camera. That image would matter later, more than I knew then. By residency, I had become too busy to sustain old illusions. Internal medicine, 70-hour weeks that pretended not to be 80. The smell of chlorhexidine and tired bodies. Shoes that never felt clean no matter how often I wiped them down. Mornings beginning in dark parking garages. Nights ending with charting and vending machine dinners. Some days I felt more machine than woman. Some days I stood in supply closets for 60 seconds just to breathe without being needed. But I was good. Not effortlessly. Consistently. I caught things. Patterns. Lapse. Small shifts in presentation. A liver issue hidden inside fatigue. A subtle arrhythmia everyone else had dismissed as anxiety. A medication interaction no one had noticed because everyone was tired and medicine is still a human system under fluorescent pressure. Attendings trusted me. Patients remembered me. Nurses nodded at me in that way professionals do, when you have proved useful enough times that words are unnecessary. That was when my father began changing. Not inwardly. Publicly. First, in tiny ways. Telling church friends. My daughter's in medicine. Then, my daughter's a doctor. Before residency was even over. Then, correcting people who said nurse, as if he had always been offended by the mistake. I noticed. Of course I noticed. So did my mother. She once called me after a Sunday service and said, almost apologetically, "He told the Thompsons he always pushed you because he knew you were capable of more." I stood in a call room holding stale coffee and said, "That's interesting." She was quiet. Then, softly, "I know." By then, I had stopped expecting repair. What I did not expect was appropriation. And that was coming next. The first time I heard my father take credit for my career, I was in a hospital corridor holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier. One of the nurses on my floor, a woman named Tasha, who knew everyone's business without ever sounding cruel about it, said, "Hey, I met your dad at church on Sunday." I looked up from my charting. That alone was strange. My father did not visit the hospital. He respected medicine from a distance, the way some men respect storms. Useful, impressive, better handled by someone else. "Oh?" I said. She smiled. "Yeah, sweet guy. He told everyone you were a doctor because you were always pushed to be excellent." There it was. I remember the exact sensation in my body. Not shock. Recognition. Like hearing a floorboard creak in a house you already know is settling wrong. I said, "Did he?" Thosha, to her credit, heard something in my voice and tilted her head slightly. "You okay?" I gave her a tired little smile. Just surprised by his version of history. She did not press. Good nurses know when silence is a form of respect. But the sentence followed me all day. You were always pushed to be excellent. Such a clever rewrite. Because it took the pressure I survived and polished it into intentional parenting. It turned resistance into discipline. Dismissal into standards. Obstruction into motivation. That is how some parents steal without touching your wallet. They steal authorship. At first, I told myself it did not matter. I was 32, a resident with calluses on my feet, student loans that looked like a small mortgage, and enough lived reality to know that truth does not become false just because a man at church edits it for applause. But it kept happening. At a cousin's engagement party, my aunt beamed at me and said, "Your father always knew you'd go far." At Easter, one of my mother's friends touched my arm and said, "Elaine says Warren was strict because he saw your potential." Strict. Another laundering word. A way to take a closed door and frame it as guidance. Then came the photo. The graduation photo from medical school. Me in my black gown and hood. My father standing beside me with his hand on my shoulder, smiling like the proud architect of something he had nearly starved to death. He started using it everywhere. Church bulletin board, Facebook, his office, apparently even his golf group text. According to Luke, who mentioned it casually one afternoon while helping our mother move patio furniture. I looked at him. He sent my graduation photo to his golf group? Luke shrugged. I mean, yeah, dads do that. I laughed once. Not because it was funny. Because brothers raised inside the same house can live next door to a fire and still think the smoke is weather. Luke noticed my expression then. What? I set down the planter I was holding. You really don't remember anything. Do you? His face changed. Not defensive. Uncomfortable. That's not fair. Isn't it? He rubbed the back of his neck. I know Dad was harder on you. Harder. I repeated the word because sometimes the size of the minimization matters more than the minimization itself. He told me girls didn't need college. Luke looked away. That was a long time ago. Yes? I said, and yet somehow it's new every time someone tells me he always believed in me. He had the decency not to answer. That was something. Not enough. But something. By then I was in my final year of residency, and the life I had built looked solid from the outside. I had an attending offer from a growing internal medicine group in Louisville. A small apartment with decent light. A reliable car. A savings account no one else knew the balance of. A coffee maker that did not rattle like it was dying. Those details mattered to me more than the title some days. Because security is a private language for people who had to translate danger young. I also had someone in my life then. His name was Eli. He was a physical therapist I met during a post-discharge care coordination meeting where we disagreed. Politely, but thoroughly. About whether a patient was actually safe to return home. He was calm in the rare way that never felt passive. The kind of man who listened all the way to the end of a sentence before deciding what it meant. We started with coffee. Then dinner. Then, the slow, unglamorous intimacy of two overworked adults learning each other in fragments. He knew about my family in pieces. Not as a grand confession. As context. A story here. A reaction there. The first time he met my parents was at my mother's 61st birthday dinner. A small restaurant. Yellow walls. Overpriced salmon. My father shook Eli's hand too long and immediately began asking where he saw his career, leveling out. That was his favorite question for men. Not who are you? What are you building? Eli answered with grace. Then later, in the parking lot, he said, Your dad talks like everyone is applying for his approval. I laughed so hard I had to lean against the car. That, I said, is the most accurate sentence anyone has ever spoken about him. Eli got quiet for a second. Then he asked, gently, Has he always tried to compete with your life? Compete. That was the word I had been missing. Because my father was not simply dismissive. Dismissal had evolved. Now that I had succeeded anyway. He needed some ownership of the outcome, or else my success became evidence against him. And evidence was the one thing he never tolerated well. When I signed my first attending contract, I did not tell my parents immediately. Not because I was hiding it. Because I wanted one thing in my life to exist for a full minute before it became family material. The offer was good. Better than good. Base salary strong. Loan repayment assistance. Reasonable call schedule. A path to partnership. My hands shook when I signed it. Afterward, I sat alone in my apartment with Thai takeout and cried over green curry because all at once I could see the whole line of my life. The kitchen table. The ribbon. The scholarships. The parking lot yogurt. The cereal aisle at the campus pantry. The call rooms. The dead-eyed 4A. M. Admission. The white coat. The contracts. No one had handed me this. Not 1 inch. I told my mother the next day. She cried before I finished the sentence. Then she whispered, "He's going to make this about him?" I leaned against my counter and closed my eyes. At least one of us is honest. She made a sound that could have been a laugh or a sob. Maybe both. Sure enough, within a week, church friends were congratulating my father on raising a doctor. Raising. Another interesting word. Because technically, yes, parents raise children. But what do we call it when one parent lays boards across the road and then stands at the finish line talking about family values? A month later, my father invited us all to a banquet hosted by his regional sales association. It was one of those annual events where men who liked golf and quarterly numbers put on dark suits, shook hands under chandeliers, and congratulated one another for surviving markets they mostly helped create. My mother asked if I was going. I said no immediately. She got quiet, then said, "He wants to mention you." I actually laughed. Of course he does. He's getting some kind of recognition. For what? Loudness? Caroline? Isail? What? Mom? She hesitated. He said he wants the family there. He wants to honor everything you've achieved. Honor. There is no insult quite like being invited to watch someone misname your pain in formal wear. I told her I would think about it. That evening, Eli came over with grocery store flowers and sat on my couch while I relayed the invitation. He listened, then said, "Do you want to go?" "No." "Then don't." I looked at him. That simple? He shrugged lightly. Simple isn't the same as easy. That irritated me. Mostly because it was true. The problem was not whether I wanted to go. The problem was that family systems train daughters like me to consider the emotional logistics of every boundary before we ever consider our own preference. If I did not go, my father would tell a story about how busy I was, or how humble I was, or how independent I had always been. If I did go, I would have to sit in a room full of strangers while he polished my life into a tribute to himself. No good option. Only choice of battlefield. In the end, I went. Not for him. Not even for my mother. For myself? Because I had spent too many years leaving rooms in advance. And there is a cost to always surrendering the witness position to the person who lies best. The banquet was held at a downtown hotel in a ballroom with cream walls, navy tablecloths, and chandeliers that looked like upside-down wedding cakes. The air smelled like coffee, perfumi, and catered chicken, trying to seem elegant. Men in dark suits, women in jewel tones. Server trays moving past with sparkling water and tiny hors d'oeuvres. No one ever really wanted, but everyone pretended were sophisticated. My father was already there when we arrived. He stood near the stage talking to two men with red faces and expensive watches. One hand in his pocket, the other curved around a drink. He looked older than he used to. Not weak, just more breakable around the edges. Gray at the temples, thinner neck. The particular stiffness men acquire when age begins taking things they thought were permanent. When he saw me, his whole expression changed. Brightened. Expanded. Ownership switching on like a light. "There she is," he said loudly enough for the men beside him to turn. "My daughter." I stopped in front of him and smiled the way professionals smile when they do not intend to answer the emotional question being asked. "Hey, Dad." He turned to the two men. "This is Caroline, first doctor in the family." One of them shook my hand and said, "Your father talks about you all the time?" I looked at my father. He grinned. And in that grin was everything. Pride. Yes. But also theater. I said, "That must be a recent development." One of the men laughed uncertainly. I'm not sure whether he had just witnessed a joke or something with sharper edges. My father's smile held. But only barely. "Always with the humor?" he said. Humor. Another laundering word. As if truth becomes playful when spoken in public by the wrong person. Dinner began with salad. Then speeches. Then an award for top regional performance, which went to my father. He walked up to the podium under soft gold lights and applause that sounded slightly too loud for what it was. I sat at a round table between Eli and my mother. Luke and Ben were at the same table with their wives. My father thanked his team, his clients, his mentors, his golf partners. Then he thanked family. Standard enough. Then he started talking about sacrifice. That was when my pulse changed. Not racing. Narrowing. A different thing. He said, "Any success I've had came from teaching my children discipline." I felt Eli turn his head slightly toward me. My mother went still. Luke looked down at his bread plate. Ben took a sip of water like a man pretending not to hear weather reports on a house fire. My father continued, "I always told them standards matter. Character matters. Education matters if it serves a real future." The room nodded along in that banquet way people do when they want speeches to sound wise and end soon. Then he smiled toward our table and said, "And I'm proud to say my daughter Caroline became the first doctor in our family because we never lowered expectations in our house." There are moments when humiliation burns, and moments when it freezes. This one froze, because I could feel every year of my life reorganizing under that sentence. The ribbon, the scholarships, the forms he withheld, the dinners where he laughed, the loans, the job hours, the pantry, the night shifts. All of it erased and replaced with "we never lowered expectations." My mother's hand closed around her napkin so tightly her knuckles went white. Eli murmured, "Jesus!" My father kept going. I pushed her hard because I knew she was capable. Sometimes kids don't appreciate that in the moment. But later they understand. A few people laughed. Warmly. Appreciatively. My throat went dry. I realized then that if I stayed silent, his version would become the version. Not because it was true, Because public memory loves confidence more than accuracy. And I was suddenly very, very tired of financing other people's comfort with my silence. Before I tell you what happened next, type boundary if you know the moment when being polite starts costing too much. Because sometimes the biggest betrayal isn't what they did years ago. It's what they dare to rename in public once you survive it. My father stepped away from the podium to applause. The MC thanked him. People lifted glasses. Someone at a nearby table said, "That's beautiful." Beautiful. I stood up. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just clearly enough that my chair moved back and the sound cut through the room. My mother whispered, "Caroline?" I looked at her. Then at the stage. Then at the room full of people ready to file my life under inspiring father story. And I walked toward the podium. The MC looked confused. My father looked confident at first. He thought I was coming to hug him. That may be the part I remember most. The certainty on his face. The absolute faith that daughters are props until proven otherwise. I reached the microphone. The room quieted in stages. You could almost hear people arranging themselves for sentiment. I turned to the MC and said, "May I?" He hesitated, then stepped back. I looked out across the ballroom. Navilinens, bread baskets, half-finished wine, faces lifted toward me under chandelier light. Then I looked at my father. And finally, after all those years, I let public truth meet public theft. "I want to thank my father," I said. He smiled. "Too soon," for giving me the clearest motivation of my life. A few people laughed, still not understanding. Good. Let them arrive naturally. I kept my voice calm. When I was 11, I won a district science fair ribbon, and he told me not to get too carried away. The room changed a little. Small shift. I felt it. When I was 15 and said I wanted to be a doctor, he told me girls don't need college the way boys do. No laughter now. No clinking glasses. Just attention sharpening. My father's face altered. Only slightly. But enough. I continued. He funded my brother's sports. School. Cars. And futures in ways he never once offered me. When I got scholarships, he called them impractical. When I got accepted to college, he refused paperwork I needed for aid. When I got into medical school, he asked whether it was worth it for a woman. At our table, Luke closed his eyes. Ben stared at the stage like he was watching a train and knew the tracks were already gone. I did not raise my voice. That was the important part. Calm terrifies liars more than rage. I did not become a doctor because my father pushed me. I said, I became a doctor in spite of him. There it was. The sentence. Simple. Unadorned. True enough to cut clean. The room was silent. Note polite silence. Impact silence. I turned slightly toward the audience. To every person here who heard that speech and thought, "What a proud father." Please understand this. There is a difference between setting standards and blocking the door. There is a difference between discipline and disbelief. There is a difference between support and taking credit after the fact. Nobody moved. Not the servers. Not the MC. Not even the men at the bar in the back. My father finally found his voice. "Caroline." That's enough. I looked at him. No. I said, enough would have been years ago. The words landed so hard. I saw one woman at a nearby table actually lower her fork onto her plate without taking the bite. I could have stopped there. Maybe some version of wisdom would have, but I had not come that far to offer half-truth for the sake of his comfort. So I finished. You don't get to call my survival your parenting. That was the line that ended him. Not physically, not dramatically, but socially, because something visible moved through the room then. Recognition. The audience understood exactly what had happened. Not every detail. Enough. Enough for the applause after his speech to rot in their own memory. Enough for his smile to have nowhere left to stand. My father looked at me like I had betrayed him. That part almost made me laugh. Because men like him treat contradiction as disloyalty when obedience has lasted too long. He said, low and furious, "You are embarrassing this family." I leaned slightly toward the microphone. "No," I said, "I'm correcting the record." Somewhere in the room, someone actually exhaled audibly. The MC stepped forward then. Uncertain. Hands half raised in that awful event host way people do when they think tone can rescue content. But before he could speak, my mother stood. Not quickly. Not dramatically. A different version of courage than mine. Slower. Older. She looked at my father and said, with a steadiness I had never heard from her in public, "She's telling the truth." The room changed again. Completely. Because my father could dismiss me as bitter, ambitious, ungrateful. But not her. Not so easily. Luke stood next. "I remember," he said. He was not looking at me. He was looking at our father. "She's right." Ben followed. Voice quieter but no less clear. "You never believed in her until other people started being impressed. If you had told me 10 years earlier that I would watch my mother and both brothers stand in a ballroom and refuse my father's version of history to his face, I would have thought grief had broken your imagination. And yet there we were." He looked from one to the other, like a man discovering his reflection had left him. The audience no longer knew where to look. At him. At me. At the family table where legacy was peeling off in public. My father straightened his jacket. A useless little act of control. Then he said the line men like him always say when reality stops agreeing with them. "I did the best I could." I nodded. Maybe he had. That was the tragedy. A man can do his best and still do harm he never intended to understand. But intention does not erase impact. And my best is not a receipt good enough to cash against someone else's life. I said, "Then you can live with being judged by the result." No one clapped. This was not that kind of moment. No triumphant music. No easy cinematic release. Just a banquet hall full of witnesses and a truth too large to fit back into family language. I handed the microphone to the MC and stepped down from the stage. My legs were steady. That surprised me. Adrenaline usually shakes me after confrontation. This time it did not. This time I felt almost light. Like I had been carrying a heavy, misnamed object for years and had finally set it down where everyone could see it. Eli met me halfway back to the table. He did not speak. Just took my hand. That mattered more than anything anyone could have said in that moment. My mother was crying quietly by the time I sat down. Not performative tears, old tears. Maybe even for herself. Luke stared straight ahead. Ben rubbed his jaw in that way. He did when he was trying not to say too much too fast. My father remained by the stage for a few seconds longer. Then he walked out of the room. No announcement. No kawat. No dramatic storming. Just departure. And that, somehow, felt fitting. He had spent years deciding which version of me deserved to exist in public. Now public had answered back. The banquet resumed in the clumsy, broken way events do after something real interrupts them. Plates were cleared. The MC made 2 bad jokes. People avoided our table at first, then approached in careful 2s and 3s with that same expression people wear at funerals and scandals. One man shook my hand and said, "That took courage." A woman I had never met whispered, "I'm glad you said it." Another leaned in and said, "I have daughters." Just that. I understood. My mother finally turned to me once the room had partly restitched itself and said, "I should have said it sooner." There it was. The sentence I had needed since childhood. Not enough to fix anything. Enough to tell the truth. I looked at her. At the woman who had slipped forms under my door and silence into every room where I needed more. "I know," I said. That was all I had. Because forgiveness is not a light switch. And I was tired of performing instant grace for people who arrived years late. Luke drove my mother home that night because she was too shaken. Ben texted me later, just after midnight. "You were right." I stared at those 3 words for a long time. Because brothers are rarely asked to see what sons are allowed to benefit from. The fact that he finally did not erase anything. But it mattered. My father did not call the next day, or the next week, or the next month. He sent one email. Subject line, "Unnecessary." The body was 3 sentences long. He said I had humiliated him publicly, exaggerated private family matters, and disrespected the sacrifices he had made. No apology, no curiosity, no accountability, just injury at being contradicted. I did not answer. That was new too. The younger version of me would have drafted a paragraph, then another, then a version softer, then one clearer, then one apologizing for the tone of truths I should never have had to defend. But by then I understood something essential. Not every accusation deserves your labor. Some people do not want explanation. They want restoration of their preferred lie. And I was done working that job. A few months later, I opened my own clinic with 2 other internists. Nothing flashy. Clean brick building. 3 exam rooms to start. Pale blue walls. A waiting room with chairs I spent too much time choosing because I wanted anxious people to feel held by the space before anyone even called their name. The first day I unlocked the front door before sunrise and stepped inside alone. The place smelled like fresh paint, unopened supplies, and coffee from the machine we had not yet learned to clean properly. I stood there in my white coat and thought of every small room I had once been told was enough for a girl like me. Kitchen tables, shared dorms, call rooms, supply closets, places built for surviving, not for owning. Then I turned on the lights. That was the real ending. Not the banquet, not the speech, not even the public correction. This A building with my name on the door. Work I had earned. Patients I served. A life not waiting for permission. My father tried once more after that. Of course he did. When the local paper ran a small feature on the clinic opening, he called my mother and said he wanted to stop by and see his daughter's place. His daughter's place. Possession sneaks back in through language when you let it. I told my mother no. No explanation. No alternative date. No, maybe later. Just no. She was quiet a long time. Then she said, almost like she was trying the feeling on herself, "That's fair." It was fair. It was also overdue. We do speak now. Sometimes. Birthdays. Short calls at Christmas. Careful. Weather-shaped conversations with no room for rewrite. He has never apologized in the way people imagine apologies should happen. No gran confession. No weeping. No declaration that he was wrong about girls and college and value and futures. What he has done instead is smaller and therefore harder to trust. He asks more questions than he used to. Listens longer. Uses the word proud carefully, as if it might burn him. Maybe that is growth. Maybe it is aging. Maybe those two things are cousins. I no longer need to decide for him. What I know is this: he does not get credit. That is the boundary. He can respect what I built. He can admire it. He can even love me in whatever clumsy, reduced form he has available now. But he does not get to stand inside the story as the reason. Because he was not. I was. Along with every teacher, counselor, mentor, physician, friend, and quiet, exhausted version of myself that kept moving when easier would have been to stop. So when people ask me what it felt like to become the first doctor in the family, I tell them the truth. It did not feel like triumph at first. It felt like relief. Then grief. Then distance. And finally, something stronger. Ownership. Not just of the degree, of the narrative. Because for women like me, sometimes the final achievement is not the title after your name. It is refusing to let the people who doubted you turn your life into evidence of their wisdom. If this story stayed with you, like the video and subscribe. And if you ever built a future while someone at home kept telling you it was unnecessary, type, "I built it anyway," in the comments. Because some of us were never encouraged. We were underestimated. And that became fuel.